New Zealand, or Aotearoa, as Maori call it, has been my home for most of my life. But today, for me, a first. I'm on my way to an emotional homecoming. Maori remains held in foreign museums are rightfully being returned to their iwi, their tribes.
The two skulls were apparently taken in about 1890 without the knowledge or approval of local iwi.
Today, we consider this acquisition of such a collection as contravening to human dignity.
On Lieutenant James Cook's voyage to New Zealand in 1769, Joseph Banks was the first to purchase a preserved human head, foreshadowing what would later become a macabre trade. On my voyage around New Zealand in the wake of Cook, I'm looking for new stories behind old history. And in doing so, trying to understand what happened and why that matters. In 1769, Cook was on his first epic Pacific voyage. So far, he and his ship, the Endeavour, had been to the Tahitian Islands. There he advanced science and navigation by mapping the transit of Venus. His men, meanwhile, traded Venus's other pleasures, swapping nails for sex. But in July, it was time to go. Before the ship departed, Joseph Banks, the botanist, persuaded Cook to take with him a guest, a high-ranking Tahitian, the extraordinary Tupaya. Tupaya was one of the most important religious leaders in Tahiti. Encouraged by Sidney Parkinson, the artist on board, Tupaya took up painting. Except it's incredible there's no known image of Tupaya himself, which is curious given that we know he was a handsome and impressive figure. But Tupaya's own painting of a chief mourner, a role that he would have played himself at various times, might serve as a kind of self-portrait. It's an enigmatic picture indeed. Cook would have no idea how critical Tupaya would become in the next few months. From Tahiti, the Endeavour sailed south under Admiralty instruction to find the fabled Great Southern Continent. But with no such land in sight, Cook turned west into the unknown. Unknown to Europeans, apart from two squiggles on a chart by the Dutchman Abel Tasman, more than a century earlier. 4 of Tasman's men had been slaughtered by Maori. Cook must have had some sense of trepidation, imagining what kind of welcome he might enjoy. After months at sea and desperate for fresh water and food, Cook has no choice but to make contact. He leads a shore party towards signs of settlement. And he spots a group on the other side of the river. He rows across with a group of officers, leaving 4 very young midshipmen here to look after the yawl. You know what a yawl is, don't you? And then, no sooner does he get there, he hears a shot. What the hell has happened? Cook dashed back and found a Maori man dead on the beach. His companions had fled the scene. This is a calamitous start. The man they killed was called Te Maro. Nick, his descendant, has agreed to meet me. One of Cook's midshipmen claimed the shot was self-defense because of the way Te Maro approached them. Cook assumes that it's a war dance in his journals.
Right.
And to an untutored eye, if you're European and this is a totally strange land, do you think it's a fair assumption?
Yes, I guess so. If they had left home that morning to come to town to do a little bit of relaxing or something, but they're sailing across the other side of the planet. What do they expect to find?
Right.
A little bit of England. They're going to find other peoples and other cultures on strange lands. That's their whole intention.
Yeah.
And in my view, they were prepared. They had weapons. The weapons were loaded. They shot Te Maro in the heart. And I think it trivialises the potency of their role on the crew to say they were just boys that were on some kind of sailing jaunt. They were on a mission, and I think this land was a brand new land with new resources, and they had some natives on it. You know, I suppose it's part of empire expansion. You know, lives will be lost, and it just happened to be Te Maro.
Tell me about Te Maro.
He was very likely going to be the next chief of his people. He was the carrier of tremendous amount of traditional knowledge about the land, about the soil and the land. So Te Maro's death meant also the loss of that knowledge.
It is a terrible day, and Cook goes back. He's full of remorse. I'd just like to think there was a ray of hope there for one moment.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. Well, we've got a rainbow in the sky today, so there's a little ray of hope for you today.
Yeah.
But and it's not raining.
Before leaving England, the Royal Society sponsoring the voyage prepared hints how to behave in new lands, saying every effort should be made to avoid violence. But Te Maro's death was just the first. The next day, Cook landed in a second attempt to get supplies. But 100 armed warriors met him with a haka, an intimidating challenge and a vital part of New Zealand culture to this day.
When I perform a haka, what's going through my head is all of our ancestors, the tribe. It feels like I'm paying tribute to them in probably the purest way I could through haka.
You know, pretty much like the brother over there, paying tribute to the ones who stood here before us, you know, and just looking up to them, asking for guidance in what we want to do in life. It's a tradition we like to keep uplifted, yeah.
Unlike the previous day, Tupaya accompanied Cook. Tupaya called out in Tahitian, and incredibly, the warriors stopped. The Polynesians clearly understood each other. Was it a breakthrough? Now some of the warriors moved in towards the English, each side close and fascinated by the other. Cook and a warrior hongi, the pressing of noses. And just for a moment, the possibility of real connection. But then, suddenly, everything turned into chaos. A sword was stolen. Cook ordered his men to shoot. They killed the thief and wounded others. This was a disaster. The second Maori killed was also an important chief, Te Rako. But his people have a different story of the events. They had come to seize the Endeavour. Cook had no idea he'd saved himself and his ship. He leaves behind the name Poverty Bay because there's not one thing that he wants that he can find there. This name is today considered something of a curse. And I'm leaving Poverty Bay, taken aback. Because that anger about those deaths on the beach all those years ago lingers to this day. As Cook sails along the coast, they're constantly met with what they interpret as hostility or aggression. For instance, one day a canoe comes alongside and an exchange takes place. Someone on board, possibly the chief, takes offense, and then they're presented with a traditional Polynesian custom. It's called whaka pauhane, and it is the bearing of one's bum. I think you don't really need to understand Polynesian custom or even speak Maori to understand that the bearing of a bum is as good an insult as they get. But in contrast to Poverty Bay, this place, Uawa, or Toliga Bay, remembers Cook's visit much more fondly. And here, despite the news about the fatal encounters in the south, Maori were eager to meet the ship because news had spread of a great man on board. And no, not Cook, but Tupaya. Lieutenant James Cook is on his first voyage to the Pacific. Unlike Tahiti, the first encounters in New Zealand have been violent and fatal. But all that was about to change.
Our people had already heard about what had happened in Poverty Bay, and so they were prepared for it. So they went out in the waka and brought them in.
Right. It's a friendly encounter. Why do you think that is?
I really think it's because Tupaya, the Tahitian priest, was calling to our people that they were coming as friends.
So everybody knows they're turning up. The news has come up the coast pretty quick.
Very, very quickly. And they wanted to know everything they possibly could know about that ship and its crew. Because the news that had come up was that there were some deaths, and that those deaths were caused by a fire stick. They wanted to know, what was this fire stick that could kill somebody at a distance? Whereas they were used to hand-to-hand combat. And some of the crew do record that many an hour was spent entertaining the locals by throwing gunpowder into the fire.
And remarkably, Tupaya, who was only here for 6 days, left such a warm feeling in this place.
Absolutely. Because Tupaya was the carrier of messages for both sides, he made out that he was the captain of that waka with sails, and he ordered Cook's crew around in his own language. And so we thought, that's typical Polynesian sense of humour. I'll tell them I'm the boss here. And he would have had a marvellous time doing that.
It's no wonder Tupaya wanted to elevate himself in the eyes of the locals. Physically tall and noble by birth, he had, until now, been having a miserable time on the ship. Cramped conditions, stale food, superior-minded company were not what Tupaya was accustomed to. But iwi here loaned this highborn priest a patch of earth to call his own, a cave where he could hold court. As a high priest from Tahiti, he had the mana or prestige of a rock star. And here I am, and it feels like a real privilege to be somewhere where so much important contact was made. I'm in Tupaya's cave with Pop. We're about the same age, but he looks half my age, which is deeply irritating. And Pop's the guardian of Tupaya's cave. And Pop, I just want to say thanks very much for allowing me to be here, and it's just such an important place.
It's a pleasure having you here, Sam.
You're the guardian of a rather sacred place.
Yes. It's got a lovely feeling here. We all respect it. This area is very sacred to us.
It would have been a very different landscape. A fortified power up here.
Yes, and would have been all native trees up in there, but you can still see a couple there anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. So this would have been Tupaya's knowledge of what had happened in the 500 years or more since Maori had migrated from Tahiti was a major revelation. Me too. Thanks to Tupaya, the English ship was restocked and the men revived. Sex may have helped in this regard, and we can safely assume that Tupaya was looked after with the same generosity. Tempting as it must have been for Tupaya to stay here, he was determined to press on to England with Cook and secure an ally in King George III, as well as firearms. For Tupaya had his own tribal politics at home to set right. Before they left Tolaga Bay, the English spent hours immersed in the landscape, collecting seeds and identifying new birds. Banks was particularly taken by this incredible rock formation, describing it as superior to art. The Maori, not so much. They called it the anus of the land. Today, some of those seeds that were taken back to England by Banks have returned. And 250 years later, the locals will replant these seeds around the cove, restoring the farmland to its natural state. A gift from the past, an extraordinary idea. Cook continued north, and his greater purpose became clear. Apart from his navigational skills and his leadership of men, I think the other thing I'm beginning to admire in him is his dedication to surveying and charting. And, if proof were needed, his work around the coast of Aotearoa, New Zealand, is in his charts. His map-making was so remarkable that portions of his work were still in use in the 1990s. But Cook's charts changed so many things. Because of their accuracy, people followed Cook's charts into the Pacific and here to the Bay of Islands in the north. The Endeavour spent a month here. Just 22 years later, before the century was out, Cook's descriptions of safe moorings and the evident abundance of gigantic creatures lured future visitors. Whales were highly lucrative to 18th and 19th century manufacturers. Everything from buggy whips to women's corsets, bone piano keys, and the handles of walking sticks, and of course, oil for lamps. Fun fact, it took only 50 years of ruthless exploitation for whaling to become commercially unviable in the South Pacific and to push most whale species to the brink of extinction. The Bay of Islands was a perfect base to and from the Southern Ocean for whalers to refit and repair their ships and to indulge their every appetite. For a time, this was the biggest whaling port in the Southern Hemisphere. This foreshore was heaving with grog shops and brothels. At any one time, there might be 20 or more vessels moored out there, and ashore were 600 whalers and sealers and just as many prostitutes plying their trade. It was known as the hellhole of the Pacific. It was a chaotic place, much given to vice and violence, which is probably quite a lot of fun if you're a whaler, who are really rather fond of vice and violence. The stories of the unions between Maori women and white or Pākehā whalers have been passed down through the generations. So tell me about your first Pākehā ancestor.
Captain John Howe, American Captain John Howe. White, pointy nose, blue eyes, tall, and was arranged to be with my great-great-grandmother, Henny Nooka. And she was black as the ace of space.
Why would you have an arranged marriage? What?
Everyone had an arranged marriage. She would have been around 19 years old, 20, and he would have been late 30s, 40, 42-ish. And that arranged marriage was because we lost power. We had to trade something. But I have to say, you know, these things happen for a reason. And now we can fit in the world a little bit more. Us little hybrids, half colonizer, half colonized.
Cook called it the Bay of Islands. What should it be called?
It's not about what it should be called. It is called. It was named, and it's named Ipipiri. And that means the stars aligned during June. And he decided to make it his. You know, he's renamed places. That's pretty powerful. And it's only powerful when you have other energies, or people, for this matter, calling it that.
It's occurred to me that every time someone like Cook names something that already has a name, he's disempowering the name that was there before.
That's right. And this is where everything changed for us. It's because of him.
I ponder on the power of language. Calling places by an English name surely made it easier for settlers to feel connected here. John Robson is a settler, and he's spent a lifetime studying Cook's charts.
I was born about 8 kilometres away from where Cook was born. So from a very early age, I had an awareness of Cook in many ways. Then I found myself visiting countries with Cook connections, and ended up coming and living here in New Zealand, where, you know, Cook is everywhere.
And 9 out of 10 things are named after Cook for some reason.
Well, there's many things that he gave names to. Though, to be fair to him, he did try to find out names. For example, I mean, he never called this North Island. He called it Te Ika a Maui. But he was also aware of his position. He was only still a very junior officer. He was only a lieutenant. And he needed to placate the people back in London and the Admiralty, which is why we have Stevens Island in the South Island.
So he was a career man.
Yeah, he was sucking up, you could call it that.
Okay. In New Zealand, Cook knew he was in a critical race for the British. The Spanish and Portuguese had made claims in the Pacific since the 16th century, and now the French, Dutch, and Russians were there. But Cook had an iron will to succeed. He pressed on northwards and reached the top of New Zealand in a blinding storm to confirm the point mapped by Abel Tasman. Persistence and precision, some of his finest qualities. Tenacity was also the hallmark of the Ngāpuhi, the northernmost iwi Cook had been trading with during his stay. They'd seen the British guns and quickly recognized the power they could wield, if only Cook would agree to part with them. Aotearoa, or New Zealand, this new land Cook encountered, was racked with intertribal warfare. The powerful Ngāpuhi iwi, or tribe, in the Bay of Islands were bent on conquest and expansion. And having witnessed Cook's cannon and muskets in action, they were keen to do business. Cook declined to give up his weaponry, but subsequently, Ngāpuhi would succeed trading with missionaries and whalers for muskets. They have scores to settle and begin a campaign of conquest against neighboring tribes, who in return need to arm up to retaliate. Whalers are knee-deep in the dirty business of arms dealing. Thus, in 1807, only a few decades after Cook refused to trade weapons, began more than 30 years of the musket wars. Guns wreaked a scale of death previously unknown. Some iwi were almost destroyed. Many tribal boundaries had to be completely redrawn. It was brutal attrition, killing some 30,000 people, perhaps a third of the Maori population. That, ironically, leaves more room for new settlers, the British. Unintended consequences. In response to Maori and settler concerns, the British government took over to establish order. In 1840, a document called the Treaty of Waitangi was signed by both representatives of the Crown and many Maori chiefs. Written in just 4 days, with critically 2 different versions, English and Maori, with small but significant differences. Today, the Waitangi Treaty Grounds are one of New Zealand's foremost attractions, and, as the brochures say, help tourists discover the birthplace of our nation. The treaty is the foundational document of the country, but it has always been problematic. The British believed that Maori were ceding sovereignty. The Maori have never believed that that is so.
Yes, Sam. You hoist it, mate.
You do the hard pulling and I'll just do the easy stuff.
I think the Maori believe the treaty was introduced with a hope of creating a good relationship with the European people, not for the European to take over their lives.
What's your view on first contact? What do you think?
I think as far as Cook and Abel Tasman, I thought they were just explorers at that time. They were just looking around on behalf of the King of England, and they were exploring. But I suppose I had to admire them that they came and they went. They came and they went. They didn't actually take control until well after, when the missionaries came with only one purpose, which was to acquire land.
Numbers alone tell you the story. In 1840, at the signing of the treaty, Europeans were vastly outnumbered by Maori. But in just 50 years, their population had shot up from 3,000 to 700,000 settlers, at least 7 times the number of Maori. 50 years after that, the country celebrated the 100th anniversary of the treaty signing. Efforts to recognize indigenous culture were made. Tainui iwi built this war canoe, a waka tawa. And the government had this meeting house, a wharenui, erected. Inside, under one roof, are wall carvings representing all Maori tribes. Not a smart idea.
So they got all these carvings here of all tribes, and they said, so that we can be all one people. You know, one thing that we must understand, that we are tribal people, each with their own way of doing things, and one tribe dare not cross the boundaries of another tribe, because otherwise there will be war. And so when they start putting carvings in of other tribes into these kind of buildings, it says that this country belongs to them. And so there was a concern.
Ah, right, okay. It sets up confrontation.
Yeah, and I can recognize one chief there, the carving there, who was eaten by that other guy. Who made a soup out of them, and they in here. But you understand what I'm trying to say?
Right.
So in other words, we see it as another takeover.
Right.
A takeover our tribal area.
It's sensitive.
Yeah, very insensitive, yeah. So there you are.
Who do we have up the top in that case?
I have no idea who the heck they have. But
Nobody knows.
Nobody knows. Nobody knows. Yeah.
consequences, intended or otherwise, what followed Cook was New Zealand becoming part of the British Empire. I suppose, as much as anything, Cook was a precursor of things to come. The colossal impact of the West upon this hemisphere, upon the Pacific. Disease, dispossession, the wholesale destruction of indigenous cultures, mostly by missionaries, colonization, and so on. And Cook could hardly have seen any of that. But as night follows day, that is what happened. After leaving the northerly tip of the country, Cook sailed down the west coast of the North Island, heading to where Tasman had his fateful encounter. Cook anchored in a nearby inlet, present-day Marlborough Sounds. This is Ship Cove. It's easy to see why Cook found this fit for purpose. There's plenty of fresh water, secure anchorage, it was sheltered, scurvy grass for the crew, and food aplenty. Cook spent much of his time surveying his whereabouts. On summiting a hill one day, he surmised the massive body of water, now called Cook Strait, separated two islands. He was starting to understand the shape of the country. Banks, on the other hand, was still puzzling over its culture. One day, he, Cook, and Tupaya were out rowing when they spied a family cooking something on the beach. They went in to investigate. When the men come ashore, they find it's deserted. There's a fresh campfire with a basket full of human bones, picked clean. Cook is strangely philosophical about this. He concludes this is a natural consequence of warfare here, that you eat your enemies. Tupaya, on the other hand, is completely horrified. To me, it is a little ironic Tupaya was appalled, because Tahitian warfare was grim indeed. Enemy heads were strung like trophies on their temples, and prisoners were disemboweled alive. But they didn't eat their foe. So when the family returned, Tupaya interrogated, "In this country, do you eat the heads as well?" No, he was told. Heads were revered. While the Endeavour was moored, an elderly man called Topa approached the ship in his canoe. He had something called toi moko to show them. So, in a basket, I imagine, he's carrying 3 heads. What are these heads? Why is he carrying these 3 heads?
In the Māori world at that time, and right up until the end of the 19th century, the way of memorialising people was either in the ultimate memento mori of the preserved human head, or of course in carving. And seeing that they were perfectly preserved, Banks immediately, as an 18th century Georgian gentleman of means, and the keeper of a cabinet of curiosities, if not an entire house, decided that he wanted one for his collection, at which point Topa was seduced by a pair of fine white drawers and parted with one of the heads.
So, let me get this right. Banks sees fit to buy a head for a used pair of underpants.
Yeah.
Banks' second-hand underpants.
But then, not that I jumped to his defence, Sam, those underpants were white linen. No Māori textile could equal white linen. And something that no one else in the tribe on the island had ever seen or worn. That was the first instance on record of the heinous trade in human heads.
No one could have predicted the consequences. The initial exchange turned into a grotesque commerce. Maori killing Maori, collecting heads and trading with Europeans. Reportedly, 2 heads bought 1 gun. James Cook.
When Cook came, everybody was really fascinated by the weaponry, by the way of controlling death. People wanted that. We tend to romanticize how Māori were, and sometimes I get really annoyed by that, because so often we are portrayed as being either stolen from or exploited. But in those periods of first encounter, we were friends and we were equals, and that Māori set the terms. Māori were conscious of what they were doing. And even though now we have taken the more righteous view of the preyed upon, we were the predators too.
As my journey continues around New Zealand, I'm continually surprised. For instance, it never occurred to me that in the toi moko trade, chiefs could further insult their enemies by sending opponent heads away from ancestral lands. But it's good to know that for whatever reason they left in the first place, repatriation is bringing them home. Cook now travels south down the east coast of the South Island with one burning question. Would this land prove to be part of the great southern continent? Traveling down the coast of the South Island in early 1770, a bet amongst the officers was about to be settled. Was this land part of a giant continent, one that many theorized must exist in this part of the world to balance the northern hemisphere? Banks was a firm believer. Cook was skeptical. When they rounded the South Cape, with no more country south or west, Cook was proved right. Tupaya had always known this to be so. Tupaya, like Cook, was also a master navigator, and he was already familiar with vast swathes of the Pacific. Cook, for whatever reason, took this knowledge less and less seriously as the voyage went on. Tupaya was a proud man, and this must have hurt terribly. He became increasingly aloof and detached, and the two men, as the voyage went on, became more and more estranged. I'm not the only one who finds Tupaya's story fascinating. Tim Finn, an old friend, has written a musical drama called The Star Navigator on the complicated relationship between Cook and Tupaya. And I've been invited to join the family jam session.
Oh, yeah.
Where's Tim Finn? Has he done a runner? Oh, no, there he is.
I started going on board the replica Endeavour in Sydney, and as soon as I got into the great cabin, it struck me immediately what a theatrical space it was because of the sort of compression. But then imagining those people in there, those big minds, those big egos, with Cook and Tupaya as the two navigators that could have been such good friends, but were never able to kind of find their way into each other's worlds.
Tupaya is really the protagonist.
Of Star Navigator, yeah, he's the strongest voice in it, and it's his story that we see. So this is a song called As Far As It Goes, and they're in Batavia, fixing up the boat, gathering supplies and provisions to head back to England. And one by one, the men begin to die. 1, 2, 3, 2, 2, 3.
Tim's story finishes with the tragic end of Tupaya's time on the ship.
You know, and the sailors got a bit fed up with him and thought he was moody and arrogant and, you know, misunderstood everything, I suppose. It was, you know, really sad. And, you know, in the end, you don't want to think of it just as a tragic story of one great navigator priest. He lives on, and it lives on, the visit and the intercommunications that went on.
Desperately homesick on the voyage to England, Tupaya became very ill, most likely with scurvy, and his pride wounded, he died from pneumonia and typhoid fever thousands of miles from Tahiti and home.
Now no one is here to share the last breaths. It wasn't supposed to be like this.
That felt great.
It's lovely, Tim.
I reckon that was the one.
Let's do it again. I was just enjoying it too much.
That was a good take.
Tupaya's memory lives on among Maori, some who even named bloodlines after him. They were able to connect because of their shared cultural history. Today, Maori and white New Zealanders, Pākehā, also have a shared history, stretching back 250 years to Cook's first footfall.
You know, first contact for us, it was a huge spiral of change immediately. From that first foot on the sand on the beach, we were never ever going to be the same again.
This is Gordon Toy. He's an old friend. He's an artist, an actor, carver, and a tattooist.
Oh, look at the comfort.
Comfort.
Rides don't get better than this.
No, they don't. How you been?
I've been good. We first met on the New Zealand film set of The Piano. And if you've seen that film, the tattooed ass is Gordon's. This is where the famous House of Natives is.
I do believe you're right, Steve.
I think I got a feeling. Whoa. Thanks, matey.
Sweet as, brother.
Oh. Wow. Oh, man.
Gordon's workshop is where he creates whakairo, or traditional Maori wood carving.
You want to do some carving?
Yeah, come on, let's...
Between you and I, Sam, don't stuff this up, all right? I'm watching out of the corner of my eye.
As Cook traveled around Polynesia, he saw carving all across the Pacific Islands. But here in New Zealand, it was after contact with Europe that carving reached a pinnacle as metal tools replaced stone and jade.
And we're really fortunate in this country to be able to have a culture that still exists and lives and breathes, you know? When the language is strong, the people are strong, and they want to sort of say, well, this is who I am. And if you don't know that, then you're kind of just lost.
If you don't know where you come from, you don't know where you're going.
Yeah, yeah. That was fucking deep, wasn't it?
It turns out wood isn't the only material that Gordon's working with today. I'm probably about to weep like a primary school girl, but I'm about to get tattooed by
I think that's...
my old friend Gordon.
You got
And he's looking more pleased than I think is a good thing. This is my boy Tim. He's about to see something he never thought he'd see in his life.
I'm glad you're taking the opportunity. Seems fitting.
Gordon's the man.
Mm-hmm, yeah.
That's quite.
You're going to decide, aren't you?
Yes.
It's better if it's you decide. Yeah.
I decide.
Yeah.
Okay. I'll be gentle.
I'm a little bit moved by this at the moment, actually. I think there's something important happening here.
Kia kaha, Sam.
No way. Following Maori tradition, Gordon picks the design of the tattoo to suit his sitter.
It looks like Moana, Papa.
Aye. It does look like the spiral in Moana. This is probably one of our most sacred symbols, actually. We use it all the time to represent somebody's path in life. You know, each road will lead them into another sort of spiral, and then they move on and move to another one, and so on and so on and so on. And the fact that these two energies are meeting and coming together, causing this effect of a spiral, is a really powerful one. Nice and steady, nice and steady. We're done. So here's the reveal, Sammy.
Oh, wow.
It's open for extensions.
Thank you, Gordon. Maori culture has become so much more respected and part of what we are as a nation. Wow. Look at that.
Sweet as.
Whoa.
Na hongi. Tēnā koe, bro.
I'm grateful for this journey and the opportunity to see this land with fresh eyes. Cook's journey concluded in March 1770 when he returned to the top of the South Island. And here he completed his chart of New Zealand, of Aotearoa, something that many people consider his finest achievement. Tasman squiggles have been transformed into an impressive full outline of the whole country. When the Endeavour left New Zealand, Cook indulged in a rare moment of feeling, naming the receding cliff Cape Farewell, a name perhaps hinting at his fondness for this land, because Aotearoa would compel Cook to return time and again. I can understand why. This place has power. Maori call it mana. Cook had followed his Admiralty's instructions perfectly, but as he later wrote, "The man who does no more than carry out his instructions will never get very far in discovery." Cook was supposed to return directly to England. He decided instead to head towards the coastline of the great land we know today as Australia and chart it.